questions. I'm going to press got it. Everybody's getting got it. Please put your questions in the chat. There are so many of us that we're going to be having to use the chat function for questions. The other thing that I want to be sure you know is that there is closed captioning available. Where it appears on your screen depends on your computer, I think. But if you wish to use it, it's going to be there. So with that, I would like to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Rabin, who is a resident of Friendship Heights, a member of Friendship Heights Neighbors Network and its board. David, thank you so much, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and to introduce our speaker, Michael Mezey. His topic is of great concern to all of us as it relates to the integrity of our constitutional system. Just 3 days ago, that system was outrageously threatened by our former president, who wished to set aside the Constitution, and as a result of his allegations of a massive fraud in the last presidential election. Although the midterm elections provide some comfort for us about voters' tolerance for such extreme and incorrect views, 7 governors and 156 members of the incoming Congress deny the results of the recent presidential election. We're fortunate that among us in Friendship Heights is a noted political scientist, Michael Mezey. He's former chair of the Department of Political Science and later dean of DePaul University's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He's the author of 5 books, the most recent one of which is The Presidential Elections, Perils of Democracy. That is a title that could not be more relevant to his topic today: the American constitutional system at risk. Can our democracy die? He will take questions following his talk, and want to remind you 4 questions. Enter them into the chat box, and we'll take them following his talk. Michael.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for attending. Just as a preview, this is not going to be an optimistic talk, and it's just almost a spoiler alert here, but let's go on. In a scene in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, one character asks another, "How did you go bankrupt?" The response was, "Gradually and then suddenly." It seems to me that this sentiment applies to the process by which democracies go bankrupt. In the case of the United States, despite this year's midterm elections, the gradual forces eroding our constitutional system are still very much at work. Until recently, we Americans have taken our political system for granted and spent little, if any, time or mental energy worrying about the sort of political upheavals that other nations experience. The cancellation of elections, coups by military leaders, the exercise and abuse of unilateral power by a single person, popular movements and actions aimed at overthrowing the political order, incidents of political and social violence and acts of political repression. All of these things are things that happen elsewhere, not here. We have assumed that we will continue to have elections on schedule, continue to respect the rule of law, and that as James Madison and his colleagues hoped, Congress and the courts would check a president who attempted to exceed his authority. The assumption has been that our constitutional system is strong enough, resilient enough, and most importantly, so firmly accepted and supported by our citizens that it will continue to withstand any and all challenges. But the experience of other nations suggests that democratic systems are far from universal, and where they exist, always fragile and difficult to maintain. They rely on a willingness of citizens and leaders to accept and respect the rules of the game that define how and who makes decisions, the processes that they follow, and the way they interact with each other. Some of these rules may be found in constitutions or laws, while others may be unwritten norms or understandings governing how government should work and how politicians should behave. And because constitutions and laws can't cover all events and are typically subject to a variety of interpretations, often it is respect for these norms that are most important to the survival of democratic systems. Democratic stability also requires a sense of national solidarity. This involves a recognition that we are all in this together, that our political opponents are fellow citizens and not our enemies, and that some modicum of civility characterizes our political discourse. And finally, of course, the stability of all political systems, democratic or not, depends upon the continued ability of government to meet the economic and cultural needs of its people. As the first quarter of the 21st century draws to a close, these norms of the American political system are very much in question. This is especially the case after 4 years of a presidency that successfully challenged and regularly ignored so many of our understandings, practices, and even formal rules for how we behave politically. Trump's crude language, his habitual lying, his racism and misogyny, his disinterest in the details of governing, his open affection for autocratic leaders, these were all unprecedented for modern era presidents. It was a presidency that culminated with a refusal of the incumbent to accept the results of an election in which he was clearly defeated, several attempts on his part to overturn the results of that election, and finally with an assault on the Congress by a mob of his supporters, acting with the explicit endorsement of the president and the encouragement of many of his legislative co-partisans. And perhaps most discouraging, it was an election in which this norm-defying incumbent received more than 74 million votes, several million less than his opponent, but still the second largest number of votes ever received by an American presidential candidate. And it is well to remember how close we came to a second Trump term. President Biden carried Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, and Wisconsin, the states that ultimately gave him his electoral college majority, by a combined total of only 75,000 votes. That's 75,000 votes out of the national total of 160 million. That close. The fact that such a man could generate such support suggests fundamental weaknesses in our political institutions and our political culture. For example, American citizens' trust in governmental institutions has steadily declined. Way back in 1964, survey researchers asked the public to say whether they trust the government in Washington. And 77% of the public said that they could trust the government in Washington all or most of the time. That's 77%. These numbers have steadily decreased over the ensuing decades, dropping to 21% in January of this year. Only 21% of the public saying that they could trust the government in Washington at least some of the time. Today, only 27% of the American public express satisfaction with our system of government and how it works. The lack of satisfaction with governmental performance seems to be bipartisan, with only 30% of the Republican respondents and 24% of Democratic respondents expressing satisfaction. To state the obvious, the fact that about 3/4 of the American people are dissatisfied with their system of government and do not trust their government at least some of the time is not a healthy sign for the future of our political institutions. As we know, Democrats and Republicans alike have questioned the fairness of our presidential elections. In one recent survey, 57% of the voters thought that the 2020 election was fair, but 61% of Republican voters disagreed, blaming fraud for Joe Biden's victory. In 2016, 51% of the voters thought that the election was fair, but 62% of Democratic respondents disagreed, blaming Russian interference for Donald Trump's victory. The increased level of political polarization and inter-party hostility that began during the Reagan administration rose to a fever pitch in the last 6 years of the Obama presidency and was a fundamental dynamic driving the politics of the Trump presidency, from his successful election campaign in 2016 to the final violent acts of January 2021, and still today. During this period, the ideological lines between Democrats and Republicans have grown more rigid and have become increasingly congruent with cultural divisions. For many white Americans, particularly those with lower levels of education, those living in rural areas, and those who identify themselves as religious fundamentalists, the image of their country as a nation where they have dominated has been challenged by the increasing number of citizens of color, the decline in religiosity among the population in general, and a growing secularism reflected in public policy decisions governing the rights of women, gay, lesbian, and transgender citizens. These attitudes have come with an enhanced level of race-based xenophobia directed at immigrants from nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. This has all taken place against the backdrop of changing demographics. In the 1950s, white citizens accounted for 89% of the American population. By 2000, that figure was 69%, and by 2020, it was 58%. These figures, along with the rise of African-American leaders, culminating with the election of Barack Obama, have stoked racial animosities that have throughout our history simmered just below and of course, often well above the surface of our politics. The attention in 2020 focused on police brutality in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, and similar events around the country aroused concerns among many Americans about racial justice issues. However, the Black Lives Matter movement and slogans such as defund the police, along with episodes of rioting in Minneapolis and Kenosha, exacerbated long-standing race-based anxieties among segments of white America, many of whom reflexively and, of course, inaccurately associate crime with people of color. For many, these demographic and cultural changes constitute an attack on their traditional view about what this country and its people should look like and stand for. The result has been a combination of fear and resentment, a theme that Republican candidates gleefully exploited in this as well as past elections going back decades. Among other segments of the population, including young people, people of color, and with the more educated segments of the country, the growing diversity in America, the heightened sensitivity to issues of race and gender, and a more tolerant view of religious differences have been accepted and applauded. This portion of our citizenry views these changes not just as a reflection of a new America, but as an expansion of the promise of liberty and human rights to those who have been denied these benefits. These two worldviews, one looking to a romanticized past and the other to an uncertain future, have been projected on the two major political parties, with the Democratic Party increasingly identified with these cultural and demographic shifts, while the Republican Party is seen as resisting these changes, presenting itself sometimes implicitly and in many cases explicitly as the bulwark against what they view as the forces challenging these traditional values and the historic construct of what an American should look like and believe. For many citizens, their party loyalties align with other parts of their identity, including race and religion, making politics an integral part of the way they perceive themselves and others. Survey research shows that differences in party identification are to an increasingly degree reflected in who people associate with, where they get their information, and how they view their fellow Americans. For example, back in 1958, and I always loved this question, one survey asked voters if it was important for their child to marry someone who identified with the same political party as they did. 33% of the Democratic respondents said yes, and 25% of the Republican respondents said yes. When that same question was asked recently, 60% of the Democratic respondents and 63% of the Republican respondents said yes, it was important that their child marry somebody of the same political party. In a Pew survey conducted in the fall of 2020, 80% of Biden voters and 77% of Trump voters indicated that they and members of the opposite party, quote, fundamentally disagree about core American values. In a poll of 1,000 people who voted for Donald Trump in 2020, 87% agreed with the statement that Democrats want to eliminate the influence of traditional values in American life and culture. 89% believed that Christianity was under attack in the United States, and 87% thought that Christian faith is an essential part of American greatness. 71% of all registered voters thought that the very future of the United States was at stake in the 2022 midterm elections, a view shared by Democrats, 74%, and Republicans at 70%. In ordinary midterm elections, they were saying, would decide the very future of the United States. Political party adherents have sharply contrasting views of the state of the nation. 80% of the Republican respondents believe that America is in danger of losing its cultural identity. Only 33% of the Democrats agree. 82% of the Democrats, but only 32% of Republicans think that immigrants strengthen the country. 68% of the Republicans, but 6% of Democrats think that the 2020 election was stolen. Finally, 84% of the Republicans think that the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists, and 85% of the Democrats think that the Republican Party has been taken over by racists. And of course, one only needs to take a cursory look at televised online campaign ads to see the degree to which these views of the other party have been stoked and reinforced by candidates and those who manage their campaigns. If one's fellow citizen is not simply someone with whom you disagree, but someone whose worldview you perceive as hostile and dangerous to you and your fundamental beliefs, the prospects for political stability sharply decrease. Scholars have for some time noted the geographic sorting that has taken place in the United States, with an increasing number of localities and neighborhoods becoming more segregated by partisan preference. Regionalism has always played an important role in understanding American politics, but the effective region has been overtaken by the divide between rural residents and those who live in urban and close-in suburban areas that have been at the center of the changing demography and traditions. This gap can be seen when election results are mapped by county, with most of the less populated and less diverse rural counties in the country bright red Republican and the more populous urban and suburban areas of the country, bright blue democratic islands in that sea of red. To the extent that these different worldviews continue to diverge, and to the extent that political leaders as well as media outlets exacerbate and exploit these divisions, the prospects for bipartisan discussion and compromise will diminish. This can have especially serious consequences for the American constitutional system, whose design of dispersed power among branches of the federal government and between that government and the various state governments requires agreement among different centers of power in order for government to act. But to the extent that political leaders and an increasing number of citizens see each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens, the ability to find common ground diminishes. Politics and government become a zero-sum game with winners and losers, rather than a negotiated game where everyone gets something and no one is shut out entirely. And if negotiations cannot take place, the alternative is governmental paralysis, where the needs of the country are unmet and the nation as a whole loses. In the long term, governmental paralysis or deadlock can undermine the stability of any political system. When government is unable to act on issues that all agree are pressing, faith in the political system suffers. Here's one obvious example. Over many years, political leaders of both parties have characterized our immigration system as broken, but no piece of legislation has emerged from Congress to address the problem. Instead, the issue has become one more political weapon wielded by Republicans to characterize Democrats as being in favor of open borders, and for Democrats to characterize Republicans as heartless racists. In most countries, economic anxiety is an important driver of political attitudes, and the United States is no exception. Here, the march toward greater levels of economic inequality goes on, with the gap between the wealthiest and the rest of the population widening every year. When measures to shrink this gap fail, some political leaders will tell the economically dispossessed and anxious that their problems are not really created by the economic system, but by certain of their fellow citizens who are receiving privileges and advantages that they do not deserve. Often they turn these anxieties against newly arrived immigrants, or toward members of minority, racial, or ethnic groups, or toward cosmopolitan elites who supposedly look down on them and ignore their concerns. These elites, they argue, have a set of beliefs about religion, race, marriage, gender, and guns that undermine their own sense of themselves, so that in addition to being economically insecure, they're encouraged to be culturally insecure. In this way, their attention is diverted away from the economic structure. The real enemy, they come to believe, are the forces attacking their identity and their values, not the forces responsible for their precarious economic condition. Others will direct their fire at the system itself, claiming that it is rigged against those with grievances. Political leaders invite such a critique through their own behavior. In election after election, they pledge to solve problems, presenting a long list of actions that they propose to take. But with a constitutional system designed to discourage significant change and partisan lines so sharply drawn, these pledges often come to naught. A natural response to this consistent disappointment is citizen apathy and eventually alienation from and outright hostility toward the political system. When citizens in democratic societies become alienated from their political system, they become vulnerable to manipulation by demagogic leaders, often those with an authoritarian bent. As residential mobility eroded community values and institutions, as the forces of modernity undermined organized religion, and as a shrinking world meant that forces well beyond one's control, or even the control of one's government, can make an individual's life markedly better or worse, citizen anxieties increase. As one scholar has put it, despair of being able to chart one's own course in a complex, cold, and bewildering world that become characteristic of a large part of the population of advanced countries. In 1941, Erich Fromm, a psychologist by training, tried to understand the rise of fascism in his native Germany, the country from which he had fled. Fromm argued that some cope with their economic and cultural despair and anxiety by identifying with and even submerging themselves in a mass movement of some sort that provides them with a sense of solidarity with others who are like them. Fromm believed that the Nazi movement, with its emphasis on Aryan superiority, its clear identification of enemies and outsiders, and its appeal to national and racial pride, provided Germans with a sense of reassurance, order, and a connection with others who are like them, especially attractive commodities at a time of national humiliation, deepening economic crisis, and the governmental paralysis of the Weimar Republic of the 1930s. Now, comparing the United States of the early 21st century with Weimar 100 years ago is tricky, but there are some disturbing parallels. Here, as cultural norms seem to shift rapidly along with the nation's demography, segments of white America that felt threatened by these changes to an increasing degree looked inward, identifying more closely with their religious and local community traditions. As Barack Obama put it, perhaps undiplomatically during his 2008 campaign, they cling to guns or religion or antipathy toward people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations. Many, of course, also find solace these days and reinforcement in online communities composed of those with similar fears and anxieties. In 2016, Donald Trump exploited all of this. His lip service to traditional values, his open hostility to immigrants and people of color more generally, his disingenuous appeal to religious fundamentalists, and his promise to make America great again provided a portion of white, alienated, and apathetic America with a sense of connection to a cause that promised a reassuring return to a time when they were in greater control of events. He amplified the sense that the country's problems stemmed from these changes and that it all would be better if we were somehow able to turn back the clock to a time when the United States was the only major economic and military power, when white people, particularly white men, controlled all the levers of authority, and when traditional Christian values supposedly guided our actions. As was the case in Germany, many people found the reassurance and order that they were seeking by connecting with a leader whose words embodied their concerns. Fromm argued that people are more likely to turn to such a leader when they feel threatened by a loss of economic or cultural status or by civil disorder. Such leaders need not necessarily deliver solutions to the problems that the nation faces. Rather, individuals are prepared to accept and support a leader who appears to understand their anxieties and take command. These leaders identify themselves with popular and patriotic symbols, name and vilify those whom they declare to be the enemies of the people, and pledge to defend the nation against such forces. They fan the fears of the public by exaggerating both the problems that the nation confronts, because they know it's the fear itself that evokes unquestioning support from their followers, and they exaggerate their capacity to solve these problems. Thus, they promise, but not necessarily deliver, order and safety to replace chaos and danger, pride in place of humiliation, superiority in place of inferiority, leadership in place of inertia, strength in place of weakness, hope in place of despair, and a return to the mores of an idealized past in place of the cultural chaos of contemporary society. The danger such leaders pose for democratic systems has long been apparent and was a major reason why the founders opposed direct election of the president. In the very first Federalist paper, Alexander Hamilton wrote that of those men who have overturned liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. Donald Trump was exactly the sort of leader that Hamilton feared. He told the culturally and economically anxious that he alone could address the causes of their discontent, and more importantly, that he alone understood their grievances. He did so by disregarding conventional ways of governing and interacting with other politicians, by unambiguously and often crudely articulating the grievances of his supporters, by appealing to raw emotions, and by promising a return to the way things used to be, a time when America was whiter, more religious, and more dominant in the world. To conclude this admittedly pessimistic analysis, I think that the gradual part of our systemic bankruptcy is all too apparent. The questioning of election results, attempts at voter suppression, the declining legitimacy of the courts as well as other political institutions, the viciousness of our political discourse, the increase in incidents of political and social violence, the omnipresence of guns, the acceptance by a significant portion of our population and some of our leaders of outright lies and paranoid conspiracy theories, the normalizing of racist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, and anti-Semitic oratory, continuing policy paralysis at the national level, and the yawning gap between red and blue America, a gap that reflects not simply policy differences, but increasingly divergent views of what our country stands for and what it means. Now, some hope that all of this will change when Donald Trump passes from the scene, and certainly there is some optimism to be drawn from the 2022 election and from Trump's multiple legal and apparently now mental challenges. But keep in mind that November did not see a Democratic landslide. The narrow divisions in the House and Senate reflect our divided country, and governmental gridlock in the next Congress is all but certain. Senator Ron Johnson, a leading voice on the election-denying far right, won re-election in Wisconsin, employing racial innuendos against his Black opponent. And the Republican candidate for governor of that state, who said that if he won, he would arrange things so that Democrats would never again win in Wisconsin, got 48% of the vote. In Nevada, Senator Masto beat Adam Laxalt, an election denier, by only 5,000 votes. And Carrie Lake, who makes Johnson and Laxalt look like moderates, and who, like Trump, came to prominence as a television personality, lost the governor's race in Arizona by only a few thousand votes. Tonight, we may find that Herschel Walker will be a United States Senator from Georgia. And finally, to quote Mark Twain, reports of Trump's political death may be exaggerated. Somehow he always seems to survive, even in the face of his recent argument that the Constitution should be suspended and that he be restored to office. Notably, no leading Republican in the House has pushed back, and the few senators who have played the game of condemning the idea without bothering to mention Trump's name. Can our democracy die? All democracies are vulnerable to failure given the right circumstances and the right leader. If it happens, to paraphrase T.S. Eliot, it won't be with a bang, but with a whimper. We are not immune to the forces that have eroded democracy in other countries. If the gradual chipping away at our political norms continues, suddenly we may wake up to find ourselves in a country that we no longer recognize. We have much to do if we are to escape that fate. Our leaders and we as a people must address the economic, cultural, and racial challenges that are the driving factors in our national discontent and rediscover and elevate a sense of national solidarity, by which I mean a commitment to each other as fellow citizens and a commitment to the fundamental values, institutions, procedures, and norms of behavior that define not just our governmental system, but our identity as Americans. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to try to answer your questions.
Yes, I'm going to start with, this is more of a comment than a question. Since 1973, the rate of politically mixed marriages in America has declined by 50%. Around a quarter of American adults identify themselves as evangelical Protestants, including parts of the Baptist, Lutheran, and Presbyterian denominations. This makes evangelicalism larger than any other religious stream in the U.S., including Catholicism and mainline Protestants. And this is apparently from the MIT Technology Review. I was wondering if you had any comments about that.
Well, I'm not surprised by that data. It reflects a real shift in the nation. It reflects a real shift in how of the nature of religious beliefs and how they affect our political attitudes. I'm glad you cited those data, and I know some of them as well. It used to be at one time when we said, if you're Jewish, I'd love my child to marry a Jewish, my daughter to marry somebody who's Jewish. These days, you say, well, whether Jewish or not, as long as they're a Democrat. That's really a change in the way we think about these things.
All right, here's a question. Can you speak to the politicization of the Supreme Court in the context of the issues you have laid out, read the executive and legislative branches of government? What can be done to curb this?
Well, the Supreme Court's not really my area of expertise. I usually leave that to my wife. But certainly, I guess certainly the appointment process to the Supreme Court has become highly politicized. There was always a political dimension to those appointments, but seemingly much more so now. And the political litmus test, if you will, that Supreme Court appointees need to pass in order to be nominated by whichever president is in power at the time and confirmed by the Senate is becoming much more stringent. Clearly anti-abortion judges. For a judge to be appointed to the Supreme Court during the Trump presidency and during the George W. Bush presidency, one had to be anti-abortion. If one was appointed to the Supreme Court during the Obama presidency, one had to be pro-choice, and it's become this way. We didn't always ask the question who appointed these judges when the case came down, but now we always talk about Trump justices, Obama justices, and so on. And so clearly the political polarization that I've been talking about certainly has reached the court and is quite just as apparent as it seems to be in the Congress.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's another question. Can you speak about the changes in how people get their news, social media, and whether this tracks in?
Of course it does. I go back far enough, and I'm sure many people on this call also go back far enough to the time when you turned on Walter Cronkite and CBS News, and Walter said, and that's the way it is. And most of us said, yes, that was the way it is. She was a reliable source of news. As we know, the television news has deteriorated. Newspaper readership is down. People are increasingly getting their news from the internet and increasingly getting the news even from television and other places, from particular places. Democrats from MSNBC, Republicans from Fox, and all the other associated online places like Breitbart on the right, Daily Costs on the left, places of that sort. So clearly, we're getting our news not so much to learn new things, but to reinforce our pre-existing predispositions. And while again, I'm reluctant to make huge blanket statements. Not everybody reads the New York Times. Not everybody reads the Washington Post. And people who read these rely on those news sources tend to be let's say a shrinking minority.
Oh, okay. Another question is, what can an ordinary American do about all this?
Well, I've asked myself that question as well, and of course, there are some obvious answers. Be active. Be involved in campaigns. Be involved in supporting candidates who want to support the traditions of our system, and I suppose, and I don't do this very well. And let me go back a second. Because we live in these silos, if you will. Walking down the streets of Friendship Heights, it's pretty rare to find a Republican, and I suppose walking through the hinterlands of Texas, it'd be very difficult to find Democrats. But we need to find ways to reach out to and try to understand at least where people who disagree with us are coming from. Clearly, the Democratic Party for a period of time really misunderstood the economic anxiety of the Midwest and the Rust Belt and folks living there. Not all the Democrats, some did understand all of that. But we need to try to open our minds to where our opponents are coming from, rather than simply write them off as incorrigible reactionaries. But again, I know that falls short of an agenda for action, but I'm not sure what that agenda for action might be. Maybe the young people. I'm always hopeful of the young people.
And here's another question. Thank you for that response. What, if anything, gives you hope? Many are trying.
Yeah. I do look for areas of hope, and I recognize that this was a rather pessimistic analysis. Certainly, I think President Biden has done a good job trying to reach out at least to some Republicans. I think that the fact that although the 2022 election was not a repudiation of the more difficult segments of American society, certainly there were a large number of prominent people on the right who were supported by Donald Trump and supported by the Republican national leadership, who lost to people who had a more balanced view of things. I'm thinking of Masters in Arizona lost to Kelly, John Fetterman's win in Pennsylvania, the Mastos win in Nevada. I mean, some of the more extreme candidates were beaten. And certainly in Michigan, where in 2016, that was one of the key states to move in Trump's direction. The Democrats had a strong resurgence under the leadership of Gretchen Whitmer. So there are there are those areas of hope, and I think people are trying to focus on those things, and there are people in Congress who are trying to be more bipartisan in what they're doing. So I do like the question. I do look for rays of hope here, but I still worry.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your questions. Please keep adding them to the chat. Here's another question, and it has to do with polls. How, where, and by whom are the poll figures you talk about obtained?
Yep. So the polling that I recognize the skepticism about polling, and so I usually don't rely very much on polling that tries to predict who people are going to vote for or election outcomes. The polling that I've looked at are from reputable organizations like the Pew Trust, people who do probably the best polling in the country on attitudes. And there are several other polling agencies. The people who do the values studies. You need to look for those people who have reliable experts who are organizing their polls and doing that. We find more success in polling when we're asking about people's attitudes rather than asking about who people are going to vote for. When you ask people on the poll who are you going to vote for, there's all sorts of strange answers, and you have to deal with turnout and how likely it is they'll vote. But when you're asking about attitudes, you generally get to more reliable results, and you have to look at the quality of the pollster.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Do you think the moderates in the Democratic Party are our best hope, or are those Democrats who support squad, which is in quotes, right? Well,
again, each party, the question is this: where is the center of a party? And to take Nancy Pelosi as an example, Nancy worked with the squad on the left and was able to work with them to bring them into some of the discussions, to have some of their priorities addressed while keeping them in the tent. But that was Nancy Pelosi, probably the most effective Speaker of the House that country's ever had. If Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker of the House and tries to do the same thing with the equivalent, the Republican squad, if you will, I think he's not going to be as successful because he doesn't have those skills. I think, in answer to the question, I think that the future of the party is with the moderates in the party, but the moderates in the party will fail unless they're prepared to address some of the economic issues that people on the left are raising. Remember that in 2016, Joe Biden won the nomination, but Bernie Sanders was a very strong second. So, because Sanders, unlike Biden, at least in the beginning, and Sanders, very much like Trump, somehow was able to connect with those economic anxieties that people in the Rust Belt had. There's data that showed, and this may sound surprising, Sanders-Trump voters in 2016. Democrats who supported Sanders in the 2016 primaries over Hillary, and then switched to Trump in the general election. So staying away from those issues and staying away from those economic issues is not exactly a recipe for success for the Democratic Party.
Thank you. Here's another question. Are you pleased that, and this comes from an octogenarian, that some of the very old leaders of the Dems are stepping down?
Oh, I think that's good. And I do believe, I hate to see Nancy Pelosi go simply because of her skills, but the new Democratic Party or at least the party needs to renew itself. And I think it's important that these new leaders come forward. I think there'll be a little bit of a rough time for them because there is a learning curve to figuring out how the system works, how it should be working, and they'll have a little bit of a rough go to begin. But I think it's a good thing, and I think the party will benefit from this change.
Thank you. Here's another question. Are there things we can learn from more successful democracies that are able to get much needed policy changes into action?
Well, it's not, I guess there are a couple of ways to answer that question. Some of the countries that are more able to do that have different constitutional systems that provide for more unified control of government, so that once the party wins the election, they can move forward with an agenda. And that's not what we have. So, and we're not about to change our constitutional system, at least in that way. I think there's very little possibility of that happening. In a sense, all of the established democracies around the world is suffering from many of these same tensions that I've identified here. In Europe, we used to talk about we always talked about, many political scientists always had Westminster envy, if only we could be like the British. But their system has some of these same tensions that we're exhibiting here in France as well. They're dealing with far right forces in that country that nearly have come to power. In Eastern Europe and Central Europe, you have very conservative governments, and sometimes, certainly in the case of Hungary and Poland, authoritarian governments coming to power. God only knows what's going to happen with the new Israeli government. So there are these religious, cultural, racial tensions besieging every democracy around the world. We're not Switzerland, so and the Swiss perhaps have a particularly unique situation. But what some of the things I've been trying to say today are more generally applicable to democracies. Democracies are not flourishing anywhere in the world these days. They're all under strain. And if you were asking me what my real concern might be here, I mean, it's not just the fate of representative democracy in the United States. It's a concern about that form of government worldwide. I think that project is under attack. If I haven't depressed you already, then maybe you've done the trick now.
All right. Well, thank you. That is scary. Here's another question. Do you think Joe should run again?
I think if Joe, as a fellow octogenarian with Joe, I think Joe should do whatever he wants to do. I know that that I would not feel up to being president at this point. So, and I'm not sure whether he really should, but I'm not in the best position to make that argument. I think in some respects the previous question about the passing of the torch to younger, newer people in Congress might apply to the presidency as well. It may be that it's time for some of the newer faces in the party to come forward. And as long as he's in this "I'm going to run" mode, these people are not going to come forward. And then you're putting the party would be putting all of its money on somebody who will be 82 or so when he's running for re-election. That's a pretty big gamble, and I'm not sure that that's a good one for the party to take. But I'm not going to sit here and say, Joe, don't go, don't do it, because I think frankly, I think he's done a remarkably good job in his last 2 years, given the problems that he was handed and the international situations with which he was confronted. I think he's done as well as any Democrat could have done in that job. And certainly, I'm fairly convinced that he was the only Democrat who could have beaten Trump.
Okay, and the same person, he has a PS to the question about whether Joe should run again. If not Joe, who?
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't have an obvious candidate there. And that's one of the problems when you have an incumbent president, and each party faces that. When there's a incumbent president, it's awkward for other people to sort of do the things that they need to do to make themselves more visible and to marshal a reasonable national campaign for office. You just don't do that. But there are certainly people out there. Governors usually have a fairly good track record of getting elected in these contexts, and there are some good Democratic governors around who, if Joe said tomorrow that he wasn't running, you might see people like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, Roy Cooper in North Carolina, even Gavin Newsom or Pritzker from Illinois. You might see people like this decide to come forward, but right now they can't do this with the president saying he's running. So, and I always tell people, it's very hard 2 years before, if there's no incumbent, it's very hard 2 years before to say, I don't see anybody who can do this. People will emerge. People will come out if there's an open process. I betray my age, but I remember in 1976, Jimmy Who, or this governor from Georgia that nobody ever heard of, was talking about being president, and people were laughing, and and all of it, he was able to establish himself and establish a viable candidacy. So, there are plenty of Democrats out there. Right now, you're not going to be able to identify a likely candidate while Biden's holding the field at bay. If Biden decides to change his mind, if Biden says, I'm not going to do it, then you'll see a lot of good people come out.
Okay, thank you. We're getting close to time, so I was wondering if you'd like to make any closing remarks, and then we'll suspend the recording and open it up to the floor.
No, I think you've heard enough from me. Again, I'll try if there are other questions here, but it's I guess I would have liked to offer a more optimistic viewpoint, but people at my age are very, very. It's very easy to say the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but. I really think that we are at a perilous point in our history, and we need to be aware of that. And I worry, of course, less for myself than I worry for my children and my grandchildren. So I'm sure many of you on this talk do as well.
Michael, this has been a wonderful, thoughtful, well-documented, provocative, and as you say, dismal talk. I think you leave us much better informed with a broader understanding of the issues that lie before us as citizens. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for being so attentive. I appreciate it.